Corey here from Local Motors, and I'm going to talk about the medallions that we make for the cruisers. That's this thing right here, and they come out looking really neat. We've had a lot of good comments about them, and people have wondered how we make them, so I'm going to talk about that process a little bit. So we start with a big piece of brass, and this is what we're using. They're cut out of 1/8 inch thick brass. There's a couple of little things here, little tricks. When you get sheet stock from a metal supplier, they normally don't cut it with a saw, they shear it. So it goes, and there's a big blade that kind of chops it like a paper cutter. And what it does is it tends to distort the edge. So that's kind of the first thing, is we have to start with a piece that's actually nice and flat and doesn't have a distorted edge. And that's going to matter later, and we'll talk about that. So anyway, we start with this. This then goes on the water jet, and we cut out a bunch of blanks. So one of the things to notice on this brass plate is you can see these little tabs. And the reason we do that, when the water jet's cutting them out, if they're not attached at all, they can fall out, and sometimes they fall at an awkward angle and they can jam the head. So when we make them, we actually leave them attached by this little piece. So when it's done, we actually grab them and snap them out, and it keeps them from coming loose before we want them to. And this is what we end up with. Now on this one, the two mounting holes are for a number 10 screw, and normally you would make these holes relatively loose, but we're actually making them tighter because we're going to use these in the next step to hold them down, and we're going to engrave it. And if the holes are loose, the part can wander. Also, if we need to make an alteration, like something changes or it doesn't engrave deep enough, we want to make sure that we can remove it and put it back in the fixture and have it end up in exactly the same place. So once we have these blanks, we're then taking these over to the grinder over there. We're polishing the edge because the water jet leaves kind of a rough surface. So we basically take it and kind of spin it in the grinder and smooth it out. So these are very nice and smooth on the outside. And then the next step is we're going to take them over to the CNC mill and go from there. Now if you look at the fixture, there's two screw holes, which are going to line up with these. We screw it down nice and tight. Once it's in there, we're actually going to look around the perimeter, make sure it's seated nice and flush all the way around. And then we run our program. The program takes about 18 minutes to go through and engrave all of the detail on this. And then when it's finished, you can see that there's brass dust all over the surface, and you can't really see the thing too well until you brush off all the chips. Cycle them all through the machine. When we're done with that, then we're going to go through the next step and show how we color to fill in the engraved portion and how we get the look. Alright, so we took all these medallions out of the CNC mill, and they're all covered in lubricant and brass dust. So all we're doing now is cleaning them up. So it's important that we get them really clean before the next step, because basically we're going to be painting them, and the paint needs to have a nice clean surface to adhere to so we get the right finish. Okay, all we're doing now is we just washed them to get all the oils off, and just giving them a quick wipe down to dry and leaving them out in the sun. The engraving tends to capture a little bit of water, so we want to make sure that they're bone dry before we put the paint on so that the paint adheres correctly. So the next step is we take a paint marker. It's the kind that's got a rattle ball inside, and this just has flat black paint. So we just take it and we take the badge, and all we're doing is letting the ink flow through all the parts that we engraved. So we try not to put on a ton of excess paint, because it just means it's more to remove later after it dries. And then we're going to leave this to dry for a couple of hours, and then we'll do the next steps.